这都是他10年前的事了。那时候是2001年，全世界都在迎接21世纪，庆祝千禧年。
The film begins with the voice of Vicky, the main character, saying that what she will tell us is a story that took place 10 years ago, in 2001. Speaking in the third person, she tells us that Hou Hsiao would never let Vicky go when she tried to leave, and she would keep coming back to him, like she was under his spell. Hou Hsiao and Vicky spend their time going to nightclubs, drinking and taking drugs. Their relationship is toxic, and Hou Hsiao is jealous and controlling. Hou Hsiao doesn't work. He borrows money to get by, and once even stole his father's Rolex to sell. He goes through Vicky's things, checks her receipts to see where she spends her money, and checks her phone card to see if she's made any long calls. He accuses her of cheating, and they fight often. Vicky gets a job at a hostess bar to help pay the rent. This makes Hou Hsiao extremely jealous, and he constantly calls her and her friends to check on her while she is working. But despite his jealousy, he still doesn't try to get a job himself. Whilst working, Vicky meets Jack, an older man who appears to be some sort of gangster. We later see Vicky in a bar, drunk, chatting up a bartender who is from Japan. She asks if one day she could visit him in Japan, and in the next scene we see that Vicky is in Yubari, staying with the boy and his family during a local film festival. Vicky eventually leaves Hou Hsiao for Jack. She tells us, repeating what was said at the beginning of the film, that he kept chasing her and she kept going back to him. We then see Hou Hsiao in a nightclub trying to speak to Vicky, but being stopped and getting into a fight. In the next scene, we see Vicky in Jack's apartment, crying. She tells Jack that Hou Hsiao has destroyed all of her things. She says that her mum wants her to go home, but she doesn't want to. She wants to stop working at the hostess bar. Jack agrees that she should try to have a normal life, and says that he can get her a job at one of the coffee shops he owns. However, Vicky continues her self-destructive ways of partying and drinking. One night, Jack returns to his apartment to find Vicky passed out on the couch. He puts a blanket over her, then leaves her there, and in the next scene we see Vicky arriving in Tokyo. We learn that Jack had to leave Taiwan quickly. He left Vicky a message to say that she could come and join him if she wanted, but she is to tell no one where he is. When Vicky gets to the hotel where Jack told her to meet him, he's not there. She tries to call him, but he doesn't answer. She never meets up with him, nor hears from him again. Vicky tells us that she stayed in Tokyo, wandering the streets, trying to blend in. She ends up in Yubari, staying with the Japanese bartender she met back in Taiwan. That year in Yubari, the snow was very heavy. Vicky tells us it was a country of snowmen, and it made her remember one time that she slept with Hou Hsiao, and he was so cold to her that he was like a snowman. That was 10 years ago, in 2001, but she never forgot. The film ends. One of the first things that stood out to me about this film was how well it captures the look and feel of the early 2000s. This era is perhaps not as easy to visualise as some others. For example, we can all quickly come up with images in our minds of the 80s or the 60s, but most would probably find it hard to think of clothes, images or feelings that are distinctly of the early 2000s. However, the careful combination of electronic music, choice of clothes and subtle use of neon and UV lights create scenes which are immediately recognisable to anyone who lived through that era. For example, the scene in which Hou Hsiao is mixing songs in his UV-lit bedroom will be instantly familiar to anyone who was in their late teens or early 20s during that period. The guy spinning decks was as much a feature of house parties in the early 2000s as the person playing the acoustic guitar was a feature of house parties in other decades. The director also does a very good job of making the nightclub scenes seem authentic. These scenes are shot almost entirely using close-ups and mid-shots, which helps to convey the crowded feeling that busy nightclubs have. Moreover, it appears that no professional dancers were used, and all of the characters dress like normal people, making the scenes seem more realistic. The film also shows the destructive hedonism of that time. For many in Taiwan, and across the world, the early 2000s was a period of heavy drinking, recreational drug use, and promiscuity. It was an interesting time when changing social attitudes combined with economic and technological conditions to create for many young people a feeling that they could truly live for the moment and not have to worry about the consequences. This was the pre-Great Recession era. It was a time when the whole world's economy seemed like it would continue to grow forever. In such an economic environment, there was far less pressure to make the sacrifices needed to focus on a career. We see this attitude in the main characters of the film. Despite appearing to be intelligent and possibly from a good family, Vicky has no desire to look for a career or even a traditional job. She is safe in the knowledge that she can make good money doing random, casual work. Hou Hsiao chooses not to work at all, but manages to get by nevertheless. And Jack lives on the edge of the formal economy, making plenty of money, it seems, by pseudo-legal and outright illegal means. As the film goes on, it becomes clear that the story is being told non-linearly. For example, we will sometimes hear Vicky narrate something, which only then appears on screen much later. In the middle of the film, we see Vicky in Japan. However, we later learn that her trip to Japan actually happened at the end of the year, and we see the trip again at the end of the film. As the non-linear storytelling only slowly becomes apparent, it is at first a little confusing. However, I think that it makes sense if we remember that this story is Vicky's memories, being told 10 years after the events took place. When we remember periods from our life, we often do so non-linearly. Our memories jump from one event to another. Moreover, showing the scene in which Vicky is in Japan in the middle of the film, even though it actually happens at the end of the story, helps to add some depth to her character. Taken away from the hedonism of her life in Taipei, we see her as a different person, and we're drawn to ask, which is the more real version of Vicky? The drug-using party girl, or the polite, curious young person, interested in travel and culture? I think that Vicky is actually a much more complex and interesting character than she may at first appear. In the early parts of the film, she seems very much to fit the stereotype of a young, naive girl trapped in a toxic relationship with a slightly older man, wasting her youth and potential because she's caught up in a world of drugs and partying that, presumably, Hou Hsiao introduced her to. Vicky tells us, through narration, that she tried to get away from him many times, yet he kept chasing her and she kept coming back to him as if she was under a spell. However, as the film goes on, we see that Vicky shares at least some of the responsibility for the toxicity of their relationship. Hou Hsiao is extremely jealous and controlling, and is paranoid about Vicky cheating. However, Vicky actually does cheat on Hou Hsiao. She cheats with Jack, and it is implied that she may have cheated other times. So whilst Hou Hsiao's behaviour is obviously not acceptable, it doesn't come entirely from nothing. We also learn that, whilst Hou Hsiao clearly enables Vicky's drug use and hedonistic lifestyle, she actually started taking drugs at 16 years old, before she met him. Also, when Vicky finally does leave Hou Hsiao for Jack, she continues her self-destructive ways, and the blame for this clearly can't be pinned on Jack, who, despite his criminal business interests, seems mature and caring. He is able and willing to give Vicky material and emotional security, and even encourages her to lead a more normal life, yet she continues to party to excess and hurt herself with drugs and alcohol. Conversely, Hou Hsiao becomes a slightly more sympathetic character as the film goes on. He is clearly not a decent person, or a good boyfriend. Amongst other things, we learn that he intentionally didn't wake Vicky up on the morning of her university entrance exam, as he was worried that if she took it, she'd pass and move on from him. This is truly a despicable act. However, it is implied later that Vicky is perhaps from a better background than Hou Hsiao. He talks about them being from two different worlds. Vicky also seems generally more intelligent and more industrious than he is. Moreover, as a young, beautiful girl, she could likely have most men she wanted, whereas, as an unemployed drug user, Vicky is probably the very best girl that Hou Hsiao could ever get. In some ways, it seems that Vicky has come down to Hou Hsiao's world, just to dip her toes for a while, for excitement and experience, but knowing, at least subconsciously, that she will move on to better things soon. Like the tourist from the rich country, who visits an impoverished part of the world, the tourist is enchanted by the traditional way of life, the food, the friendliness of the locals, and so on. The tourist falls in love with the place, but only because she knows that her stay there is temporary, and she will soon go back to the material and cultural comforts of her home country. Meanwhile, the locals remain there, dealing with the full reality of their lives. Likewise, Vicky gets to enjoy the excitement of Hou Hsiao's world for a short time, but Hou Hsiao knows he is destined for nothing more than what he currently has. This does not justify Hou Hsiao's behaviour, of course, but it does help us to see that Vicky is more than just a victim. In a sense, she is using Hou Hsiao as a stepping stone on her journey to adulthood and self-discovery. We see this also in her other relationships. Would she have fallen for Jack, a much older, less attractive man, if he had not been able to provide her with material comfort and security? Would she have begun a relationship with the Japanese bartender if he had not been able to provide her with the opportunity to visit and stay with him in Japan? It is not that Vicky is necessarily a bad person, nor does her behaviour excuse or justify the truly horrible things that Hou Hao does, but recognising Vicky's own agency and recognising the tragic nature of Hou Hao's situation shows the characters as much more complex and realistic than they first appear. Millennium Mambo won't be for everyone. It's slow-paced, the non-linear storytelling can be confusing, the depth of the characters is not immediately evident without further reflection, and not a great deal happens in the story. However, I found it to be a very thought-provoking film, with an incredible soundtrack and engrossing cinematography. So if you're looking for a deceptively complex film that offers a realistic portrayal of an era and lifestyle which few films explore, or if you're looking for an entry point into the works of Hou Hsiao-hsien, then I would definitely recommend Millennium Mambo.